I have never played a Silent Hill game before, aside from a short message, but we don't talk about that game. I've always wanted to play the originals, but was never able to, so I was excited for this remake to come out. Now, I don't know how faithful it was to the original, that's not for me to decide, but I did enjoy my time with it. It does make me want to play the other Silent Hill games, which is a pretty good accomplishment. Although it is far from perfect, specifically in the gameplay department, which is what I want to focus on in this video.
Mary, could you really be in this town?
Before I go into analyzing the gameplay, I want to give my thoughts on the game overall, just like a quick spoiler-free review. This game has excellent visual and sound design. They work together to create a unique and enthralling atmosphere. The sound design is the standout with its extreme variety, from the blaring sirens to the radio static to the relaxing guitar riffs. It all sounds so good. The world they created feels very lived in with several distinct areas. The only real issue I have is the look and feel when wandering the streets of Silent Hill. I just found it to be bland with no real hook, just several generic feeling shops, the only interesting part being the fog. This issue is partly because of the gameplay, which I'll get into later. I also have several small issues like some of the facial animations and glitches, but nothing worth focusing on. Overall, they nailed the visual and sound design. The strongest aspect of this game is definitely the narrative. I love how nuanced and mysterious it is. The slow and subtle build-up of the central plot twist is amazing. It makes that reveal 10 times more impactful. The side characters, Eddie and Angela, were great additions. They perfectly complement James's development. The environmental storytelling and symbolism adds a lot as well. I have no real complaints aside from not liking that opening scene with that redundant and overt inner monologue. Overall, just an immersive narrative that makes this game really special. Again, the gameplay is my biggest point of contention. It's not terrible, but it did take away from the experience. I'm mainly talking about the combat. It's poorly balanced and conflicts with the tone of the game. It feels more like action horror, but it's so simplistic and easy to master that it removes the horror factor and just becomes hollow action. I recommend playing this game on the hard combat difficulty, even though it still isn't great. It's still the best way to experience the game. The puzzles, I would say keep that on standard because they are still relatively challenging without any BS. Don't worry, we'll get into that. The puzzles overall aren't anything crazy. Most of them are simple, and some the game just solves for you, but they still make you think at least a little bit. The level design also isn't too shabby for the most part. Overall, the gameplay doesn't completely ruin the game. It's just not a strong suit. From what I've heard about the original, it's the same way. Oh, I almost forgot, the camera can seriously be a bit of a dink. Hashtag under the mayo.
What is happening? What is happening? Excuse me?
As I said, I did enjoy my experience and I don't regret the purchase at all. I would recommend anyone who likes horror games, especially psychological horror games, to check this out. It's pretty good. It's just got its issues like anything else. Anyway, into the gameplay deep dive. I've categorized it into 3 parts: combat, puzzles, and level design. There will be heavy gameplay spoilers and light story spoilers. You've been warned. My biggest issue with the gameplay is the combat. It's just way too forgiving for being a horror game that's supposed to make you feel oppressed by your environment. I could forgive the easy combat if it had some sort of depth, but it just doesn't. It feels very tedious and monotonous. There are 4 ways to deal with enemies: the plank/pipe, the pistol, the shotgun, and the rifle. You have a decent melee weapon you can use when you're backed into a corner without any ammo. You have a general use gun that can work in any situation as long as you're careful with your shots. You have a high-powered close range gun that you can use to easily break yourself out of a tight spot. Finally, you have another high-powered gun used to pick off enemies from afar, while being able to use it at close range with careful aiming. This seems like a perfect combination until you factor in the dodge mechanic. This dodge mechanic throws off the entire combat balance because of how forgiving it is. The number of iframes it has puts Dark Souls 2 to shame, an actual action-adventure game. It has too quick of a recovery. When you combine it with the melee weapon that lasts forever, does good damage, and has a quick recovery as well, it just trivializes the combat. It's an OP combo. I mean, you can literally dodge cancel your swing's startup animation. That's crazy. This combo makes it so that your guns just aren't needed at all. That means you can get by most enemy encounters without consuming resources, making it easy to stock up on the already plentiful ammo and healing items. I rarely, if ever, use the shotgun or rifle on any basic enemy. Because of this, the combat loses all tension. It loses the scare factor. The state of the melee dodge combo isn't necessarily bad on its own. All they needed to do was make sure the enemies had movesets to compete with it. So let's take a look at these enemies. The lying figures are the first enemies you'll encounter, and they don't do a great job of matching the oomph of the dodge mechanic. They're slow and clumsy, easy to deal with. These guys have a headbutt, a grab you have to mash out of, and several puking attacks. It's a pretty slow, basic moveset. While they are pretty much a joke to deal with, you do have to pay attention to the direction you dodge when they perform one of their puke attacks, which is just dodging left or right, but it does add a tiny dimension that the other enemies just don't have. They're still trivial enemies. It doesn't help that the first area, Silent Hill East, gives you way too much breathing room to deal with them, to learn their attacks. The dodge just wasn't made for them. They're too slow and predictable. Now, that could have been the point, since later on they're used more in groups of enemies. They're, kind of more zoners, but you fight them too often by themselves, and the enemy variety just doesn't help their case. The creepers don't actually pose a physical threat in combat, but I wanted to quickly mention them because I really like their inclusion. I love how they play mind games. They activate your radio just like any other enemy, making you think an actual threat is near, and even just their presence while you fight an actual enemy can add pressure because they can bite you for damage. They add a dimension to when you're swarmed with enemies or when you're navigating an unfamiliar place. They're just a neat little addition to the small enemy roster. The mannequins feel like the first actual attempt to challenge the players in melee combat, as they're more aggressive and they can dodge your melee attacks. While they're definitely a step up from the line figures, they still don't do much for me outside of the first hour of encounters with them. They also have a pretty simple pattern. You're basically just trading blows. When they dodge, expect them to attack once, then attack them back like twice, then expect retaliation and repeat. This is with the hard difficulty in mind, by the way. It's even easier on standard. It can be tricky to learn at first, but they have such a consistent pattern with only a handful of moves, so it isn't that hard to figure them out. They don't even have any gotcha moves like the line figures back up throw up. This game is also pretty long, and these are the most common enemies you'll be fighting, so you have plenty of chances to get them down. Despite their best efforts, they can still be trivialized by the melee dodge combo. The bubblehead nurses with the pipe are the first real challenge to the main combat, and that is because they have a lot more health, meaning there is more room for error. They also have actual combos where you have to dodge in quick succession, but they still have a limited moveset and their attacks are very telegraphed. There are large windows in between attacks, and they just aren't bad to deal with at all. As long as you're just paying attention. Much like the previous enemies, they are super easy one-on-one. I will say, because of the fights lasting so long, because of their, large health pool, I end up softening them with a few bullets before engaging in melee. So they do get me to use some bullets, just not enough to counteract how plentiful the game is with them, and it's only because I find their fights tedious after a while. Just like the mannequin, you settle into a pretty consistent rhythm. They are built more towards countering the dodge mechanic, but they aren't quite there because they still are relatively slow and predictable with decently large openings in between attacks. The bubblehead nurses with the knife are the only enemies in the game that I think mostly counters the dodge mechanic. They swing so erratically with such a small weapon that it's hard to get a good read on their attacks, even after 3 playthroughs. Combine their erratic moveset with the high damage and health of the normal nurses, and you got yourself the only enemy I usually avoid melee engagement with. At the most, I'll soften them up with plenty of pistol rounds, so it'll only take a few swings to finish them off. I think they were designed pretty well with the dodging in mind. Now, I could probably learn them if I tried, as there have been times when I've dodged their flurries successfully, but their attack pattern has steered me away from wanting to learn them, so that's a win in my book. Then there's the Mandarin and Spider-like mannequins. Both of these fellows are kind of just there. They both are pretty easy to avoid by listening to their sound cues, and I usually just run past these guys as much as I can. The Spider mannequins are super weak, and with the Mandarins, you can't even engage in melee combat with them with one exception. They're both just boring enemies in general. The only enemies left are the 5 bosses, Pyramid Head, Flesh Lips, Abstract Daddy, Eddie, and the final boss. All of them are alright. They all consist of running in a circle, shooting and dodging easily readable attacks. They're just not very interesting. Just look at the abstract daddy style. You'd think they add a puzzle element to these bosses or something. I didn't fight these guys with melee because they're all tanky, obviously. Plus, there is no better occasion to burn the hundreds of ammo I had than on a boss. The enemies overall just don't do a great job of creating engaging combat encounters. They just weren't built for the dodge mechanic outside of one for which all you have to do is use a few bullets from your endless supply. They aren't all complete failures, as you do have to learn their movesets initially, but that is far from a hard task, especially considering how small the enemy variety is. We walked through 7 enemies, but there are really only 5 unique enemies, 2 being variants, and one of those 5 is pretty much a non-factor, the Mandarins. The rest are introduced in the first half of the game that took me over 13 hours to beat. The second half does not introduce any real new enemy types. This means that I'm stuck fighting these same old enemies that I've already learned how to deal with for at least 6 more hours. If this game had more enemy variety, the combat would definitely improve since there would be more movesets to learn. Even if every fight was still simple and trivial, it would still keep things fresh. The combat just takes away from the game for me. It isn't stressful most of the time. It's more tedious than anything. There is no reason to avoid enemies other than because you don't want to fight the 100th whatever again. It takes away from the horror. Scripted stuff like the Pyramid Head chases don't do much for me. I need a reason to be afraid in gameplay. This doesn't accomplish that. It's too simple and too easy. That's a really unengaging combination to have, and it's really all because of that melee dodge combo. I do have some suggestions for how they could fix this problem without reworking the whole game. My first idea is a stamina bar, making it so swinging your melee weapon and dodging costs stamina, not unlike Dark Souls. This would mean you would have to be more careful in melee combat. It would need to be a pretty small pool to encourage avoiding it altogether, really. It would at least not allow for dodge spamming. My second idea is to make enemy movesets more complex and random instead of adding more enemy variety. Right now most are too predictable. If they all had movesets like the Knife Nurse, it would yield to much more tense encounters. My third idea is to make the melee weapon have durability. I'm not saying it should ever permanently break, but maybe have some sort of upkeep to keep it in good condition, or else it'll drop in damage. This would require adding an additional resource to the game, but it would create some interesting decisions in combat. My final and simplest idea is to just nerf melee and dodging, like decreasing damage or iframes and increasing recovery time. This is my least favorite idea since it takes away rather than expanding, but this is one way to definitely improve it. Maybe remove dodge canceling at the very least. I think using one or all of these changes would fix the melee dodge combo to some degree without outright reworking it. That, plus making resources more scarce, would make for a much more engaging combat loop because this would take the advantage away from the player. It'd also make it so the gameplay had some scare factor to it. Again, the combat isn't terrible, it just takes away from the horror experience. The one thing I will compliment it on is the weightiness of it. You can really feel each blow of your pipe when fighting an enemy. It's satisfying for the first 50 or so kills, but it gets old for the 300 after that. The combat as it is now is very dull. The puzzles are interesting to talk about because of how they change based on the difficulty. Looking at the puzzles from the standard perspective, I think they're pretty good. They don't blow me away, but I like most of them. Now, when you look at the hard puzzles, they aren't as good or interesting to me. The hard puzzles often just make the wording more confusing, or they just make minor changes, like the moth puzzle adding multiplication and division to get the code, or making the symbols smaller in that chalk room puzzle. That doesn't really do much for me. I mean, it does increase the difficulty, but not in a way that I really care about. It also just straight up ruins some of the puzzles. There are 3 puzzles I want to point out: the coin puzzle, the Jackson puzzle, and the Brookhaven padlock puzzle. The coin puzzle's first and second verses are fine. They're made to be more confusing, but it still makes sense when you break it down. I wish it were more clever than just being abstract, though. It's the second verse that is donkey. It reads, "His blade strikes that which from the roots doth rise." You'd expect that to be where the tree roots are because they rise into becoming a tree. They're the only roots in the image, but no, it meant the flowers for some reason. It seems to think that flowers are roots, but from my knowledge, that isn't the case. You can't even see their roots. You can only see the tree's roots, which is why it just doesn't make sense. It's misleading, it's lying, it's straight up BS. The Jackson puzzle, I really like the concept for, calculating an equation based on hidden, in quotes, messaging within a normal looking note. I do wish that the hidden equation was a bit more subtle, but that's not my issue. The issue is that you're supposed to add a random zero to the solution to get the code. There isn't really anything to suggest that zero other than the back of the note with the 4 x's, but all that made me think was that I was solving the equation wrong. If something more alluded to it, maybe in the wording of the note, then I wouldn't have as much of a problem, but as it is right now, it's a cheap trick. That's all it is. BS. The Brookhaven padlock puzzle was almost so good. It makes me heated that it screwed up the wording for that first part where it says as high as when referencing different numbers. The reason why this is so stupid is because it's supposed to suggest adding those two numbers together, but that's not what as high as means. It actually means that two things are equal in height to each other, not that they combine into something greater. The numbers in question for this part are 2 and 7. If we were going by the actual meaning of that phrase, it is saying that 2 is as high as 7 or 2 equals 7. 2 essentially becoming 7 with them being equal in value. The puzzle, however, says that it's actually 2 plus 7. That's BS. I pretty much had it solved and I enjoyed figuring it out, except for this dumb detail that just straight up lies to you. It ruins the entire puzzle. This is why it's best to stick to standard difficulty. Now there are some problems with the puzzles that are shared across multiple difficulties, mostly with them being way too easy. Every pushing cart puzzle is lame. There's a clock puzzle in the Blue Creek apartments. You don't even really have to think because it's just easy to trial and error it. The bracelets from the patients in the Brookhaven hospital are the same way. I accidentally did that one. Torturing the actual mannequin in the Otherworld hospital puzzle with the instrument can barely even be called a puzzle. The same with turning on the generator. Those just felt like padding, especially compared to the last one with the lights, pills, and clock. That was done very well. Then my favorite one to clown on is the typewriter puzzle where you're supposed to type in the word sick to solve it, but you can literally just press anything on the keyboard and it'll solve it for you. It's a literal joke. I'm hoping it has to be a glitch or something because that is insane if it's intentional. It's worse than that stupid piano puzzle in RE8 somehow. Anyway, I'm sure you get the point. Some of the puzzles didn't get as much thought put into as others. If there was more of a progression in difficulty, I would understand, but you can go from a solid puzzle that made you think to a brain-dead puzzle right after. While I do have my issues, I do think most of the puzzles are serviceable, with several being very good. The only ones that took anything away from the experience were those 3 hard versions of the puzzles and that hilariously bad typewriter puzzle, in quotes, of course. I like them overall. Finally, the level design. They did a solid job, but there are some weak segments, especially on replay. I'll look at each section as they show up in the game. The first section is Silent Hill East. This is the opening when you first enter Silent Hill. I think this is one of the weaker sections. My biggest problem is how empty it feels. There are only a handful of generic shops that you can visit. The streets are also way too wide, making it super easy to run past the lying figures, making them a non-threat, non-scary. It was also kind of a nightmare for me because I'm the kind of person who likes to explore every nook and cranny, so I was constantly running into locked doors in areas with nothing in them. It didn't give me the best impression the first time through, but now, since I know where to go and what's worth exploring, it isn't as bad. Once I got into the Woodside apartments, things started to pick up. I loved how it was constantly looping me around the building, slowly unlocking more and more of it. It has a very smooth progression that pulled me in way more than the previous area. The tight corridors helped create more tension with the enemies as well, especially with the mannequins being introduced here. This was when I was just learning them, so this is when they were actually threatening. I really do love this section, but it's a bit sad that the Blue Creek Apartments right after this does get a bit worse. It's much more linear with little exploration, but it is brief and still a small part of an earlier level, so I didn't mind it too much, but this section specifically of the apartments does get monotonous on repeat playthroughs. Then we get an intermission through Silent Hill West, which I have similar complaints about as the east side, but I like it a bit more because this part actually feels like a transition, rather than feeling like an entire level. This part is more focused on story beats than anything, which is fine. Once you get into the Brookhaven Hospital, this game really gets going. This place is expansive with a lot of looping interconnectivity and non-linearity. It is the peak of the exploration. The puzzles were pretty consistent as well, and I really love the environmental puzzles, or whatever you call them, where you find items, maybe have to combine them, and use the knowledge you gained through exploration to figure out where to use them. I just really love this aspect that this location excels at. When you get to the otherworld version of the hospital, just like the Blue Creek Apartments, it does drop off because 2 of the puzzles are lame and it loses that non-linear interconnectivity, but it's not terrible. And as a whole, this hospital section is just the highlight of the game. Then we get another transition area through the west again, and this time without the fog, so it's even less interesting than before, and it just lacks any meaningful exploration. This part does attempt 2 paths for you to take, but it just feels so arbitrary, it doesn't do it for me. Plus you have that long straight trek of nothing to the Historical Society, and then right after that, that long staircase, and I kinda just wish it was the staircase so it would feel more like a novelty. I get that it's a transition area, but there are ways to make transitions interesting. That long staircase leads you to the Toluca prison, which I didn't really enjoy. It's a location that seems like it would be good since it does have that interconnectivity, but it's still so linear while being the size of a shoebox. It'd be one thing if this location were brief, but it stretches itself thin. You open so many doors that just lead to small dead-end rooms that are super gray and repetitive. It's so tedious. It doesn't help that the main enemy of this area is a joke and that the combat has already kind of lost its charm by this point. It's just an unengaging door opening simulator. After that, you get to an area that's just as bad, the Labyrinth. The funny part about this is that it's called the Labyrinth while being one of the most linear sections of the game. Most of it is just long hallways that lead to small rooms with a key item, and then you just loop back to the start. There's just nothing confusing about it. There's like maybe a handful of dead ends. You can probably count them on one hand. The most interesting part is the rotating cube, but it's so basic that it lacks charm. All it does is act as a bridge to the next section of this location. It's another bland location that isn't as tedious as the prison because it is shorter, but it's just such a sad waste of potential. Both the prison and Labyrinth are weak areas. On the first playthrough, they aren't terrible, but on repeat playthroughs, they're an absolute slog. I do want to offer some ways I think these 2 locations could be improved. Unlike the gameplay changes I suggested, these will be a lot more drastic. For the Toluca prison, I think it's best if they keep everything confined to the main area, just the first and second floors. There can be some small additions outside of the main area, but nothing crazy like that whole separate section that's there right now. I would make more use of the cells to create more interconnectivity. Make them more than just some empty rooms with bullets and ammo. And maybe remove those animal doors and change the balance puzzle to affect like which cells doors open, which then kind of like leads you through different areas. Like you'd have to go through different cells each time you make your way from the yard to the armory. This would probably require a couple more cells than what is in the main area. This would help make the dense area feel more interesting as it is always changing but in a predictable way. I would probably also lessen the amount of paperweights needed for the balance puzzle, or at least make it to where the player doesn't go for them one at a time. If it were made to where you can get like multiple weights different ways, that would create some non-linearity, and also it would kind of make it less tedious and a bit more brief, especially on replay, but it would keep things interesting still. Another thing this section needs is better threats. Maybe a new enemy that works more with the gimmick of the light, which would be better than the weak mannequin variant that we have. Or maybe just have it to where when the lights are off, more enemies that we've already seen spawn in. And honestly, you don't even have to do those two things that I just mentioned. You could do something as simple as traps. This would even fit with the location considering that the prisoners were toying with the guards. It just needs something more to create tension. Overall, I think this area would just benefit from being shorter to allow for more time in the labyrinth, the more interesting location with the most wasted potential. Introverted Robot suggested during his stream of the game that the labyrinth would be improved if we just weren't given a map. I agree. That is the simplest solution that goes a decently long way. It would help mask the linearity, make it feel more like a maze. Ideally though, I would rather have the location completely reworked. I think that making the entire area the rotating cube would be far more engaging. You rotate it from the outside and everything within it has changed. Make it so that it has that abstract look and absence of linear space. This would definitely require the cube to be massive with a very complex layout, so I know this is a big ask. It probably isn't that feasible in a game with this many locations. But I'd rather them just get rid of the cube altogether instead if that's the case, because it's essentially just matching symbols to unlock a staircase. Just make a more complex maze with dead ends, loops, and whatever. Maybe some cool gimmicks like it constantly changing as you move through it or something. I know this is pretty abstract and a lot of it is idealized thinking, but it just needed more time in the oven overall. It just needed something to feel more like an actual labyrinth, which getting rid of the map would be a realistic step towards. Again, these two areas aren't terrible as they are right now. There's just a lot of room to grow. A boss fight and a boat ride later, we get to the Lakeview Hotel. Thankfully, this takes after the Brookhaven Hospital with its level design. It starts out linear but quickly opens up once you get to the second floor. I praise this section for all of the same reasons as the hospital. My only complaint would be the no item stealth section. It's a fine idea, but it feels very unnatural and tacky. It's such a confined space with little to no exploration. It's a small collectathon where you run in a circle, basically. RE8 got away with this somewhat because it had a uniquely horrifying monster in that area, but here all we get are some reused enemies. I mean, you literally fight one in the fireplace room just before this. Still, it's not too bad on a first playthrough as it's only a small section. The rest of the location is great otherwise. That's about all the distinct locations. Overall, I'd say the level design is decently good. When it hits, it definitely hits, but it does have some lows. However, the only locations that directly harmed my experience on a first playthrough are the streets of Silent Hill. It's just on repeat playthroughs where some can become a slog. There are two things I want to mention before I conclude this video that I didn't know where to talk about, so I'll just mention them here. The first is the hesitation James has when he's about to fist or plunge into a hole. I get that it's supposed to show his hesitation and make the player believe something was going to happen, but it never does, and it just got repetitive. It felt so artificial to me that it took me out a little bit. The second is the clunky interaction targeting, like when you go to pick up an item but James won't do it unless you're at this specific angle. It can be a nightmare, especially during boss fights or when you have the interaction icons turned off. You can miss something by little fault of your own. This isn't everything I have to say on this game, but I wanted to focus on the important things. While this video is more negative, I hopefully came across as constructive as I think I did. As I said, I do think this game is solid as a whole. I enjoyed this game and want any future remakes, new Silent Hill games, or really any project Bloober does from here on out to improve. To be better than this already, solid game. While I may not think it's a masterpiece, it definitely turned me into a Silent Hill fan.
We're burglars!
No, we're not. We just needed to get out of the rain, and we thought this place was abandoned, so...
So we came here to burgle your turts.
No, it's not true.
It's true! Oh, okay, I give up.